When truth loses its place, everything built upon it begins to crumble. Most people believe that the erosion of education and the rise of relativism is just the result of progress, an evolution toward inclusivity, a modernization of values. That assumption may bring temporary comfort in a society allergic to certainty, but it oversimplifies a truth far more tragic and far more dangerous. In reality, when the foundation of absolute truth is dismantled, what follows is not enlightenment, but entropy. And when Allan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind, he wasn't lamenting lost traditions, he was warning of a civilizational unraveling masked as liberation. He saw what many refused to, that relativism wasn't just an idea, it was a quiet spiritual coup. Let us now expose the truths they never wanted you to see. The truths our culture drowned beneath noise, ego, and self-worship. Beneath the celebration of openness is a fear of truth. What Bloom understood, and what they don't want you to know, is that our so-called open minds are not truly open. They are terrified. Terrified of truth. Terrified of judgment. Terrified of being told that not all values are equal. Relativism cloaks itself in the language of tolerance and progress, but its core is fear. The fear that someone, somewhere, might claim to know what is right. In this new world, to be certain is to be dangerous. To speak truth is to offend, and to draw a moral line is to invite exile. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, strategic. We stopped asking what is good and began asking only what feels good. We stopped honoring wisdom and started elevating preference, and in the process, we built an entire cultural framework on the quicksand of emotional affirmation. This is not openness. This is evasion. And Bloom saw it clearly. He saw students no longer asking deep philosophical questions, but asking how not to be judged. He saw a fear of answers masked as a love of inquiry, a society that claimed to love debate, but could not tolerate dissent. And so we embraced non-judgment as the highest virtue. But in doing so, we judged truth itself as too heavy, too divisive, too rigid for modern minds. We traded clarity for confusion, conviction for consensus, and we called this progress. Bloom knew better. He knew that an open mind is not one that rejects truth, but one that seeks it with rigor, with humility, and with the courage to be wrong. But the modern mind, terrified of error, chose comfort, and in choosing comfort, it rejected discipline, order, and the very pursuit of the good. Relativism presents itself as freedom, but it is a prison with invisible walls. The mind that rejects absolutes does not become more enlightened. It becomes more fragile. The very word discrimination, once a sign of discernment and wisdom, became an accusation. And with it, we lost the courage to call anything good or evil. This cultural shift wasn't neutral. It was strategic. Because once you remove truth, all that's left is power. The ego is no longer disciplined by virtue. It is inflated by applause. And so, under the guise of openness, we close the mind, not to opinions, but to judgment, not to ideas, but to meaning. Bloom warned us we didn't get rid of dogma. We replaced it with self-idolatry. The ego they worship is the identity they cannot escape. In a world where all values are equal, identity becomes sacred, but not in the spiritual sense. It becomes a shield against accountability, a fortress against introspection. Who you are replaces what is true. This is the lie of the modern age, that the self is sovereign, that no truth outside your feelings can restrain you, that your lived experience is the final authority. What Bloom tried to show us was that relativism doesn't liberate the individual, it isolates them. It seduces them into believing they are gods. But the god of ego is not eternal. It is desperate, and it must be constantly fed. The modern student, Bloom said, no longer seeks wisdom. They seek affirmation. They no longer read to be transformed. They read to be flattered. And in this shift, the university became not a sanctuary of inquiry, but a cathedral of narcissism. The modern mind is not liberated, it is lost. They will tell you the modern mind is free, that it has shaken off the shackles of superstition, tradition, hierarchy, and restraint, that it has transcended the need for objective truth, absolute values, or metaphysical purpose. But what they don't want you to see, what Bloom laid bare, is that the modern mind is not liberated. It is lost, not aimlessly wandering, but frantically sprinting in circles, not silent and searching, but deafened by its own noise. The modern mind did not escape the prison. It tore down the walls and built a maze. And now it runs, not toward truth, but away from it, away from responsibility, away from reverence, away from reality itself. We were promised that relativism would free us, that by rejecting absolutes, we would gain empathy, that by silencing judgment, we would find peace, that by tearing down the old, we would discover something better. But all we discovered was emptiness. The student, once a seeker of wisdom, now arrives at the university not with questions, but with scripts, not with wonder, but with slogans, not with reverence for the past, but with suspicion toward anything that predates their feelings. They are not taught to think, they are trained to react, to emote, to affirm, to deconstruct, and they call this freedom. But Bloom saw through the performance. He saw that when you strip away objective truth, you do not get intellectual liberation, you get intellectual despair, you get minds so terrified of offending that they stop engaging. You get students who can recite theories but not form convictions, who can critique Western civilization but not name what would replace it, who can deconstruct faith but cannot build a soul. This is not growth, this is collapse. The modern mind has not ascended to a higher form of consciousness. It has descended into abstraction, into confusion, into contradiction. It speaks endlessly of meaning, but denies the very possibility of any universal meaning. It demands dignity, but laughs at the idea that we are made in the image of anything higher than ourselves. It is like a ship that cut its anchor to sail freely, only to discover it can no longer steer. And now it drifts, endlessly, aimlessly, proud of its motion, unaware of its direction. Bloom did not merely grieve the decline of the university. He grieved the loss of the soul it was meant to form. The liberal arts were not designed to flatter the ego. They were forged to humble it. Philosophy, literature, theology, these were not hobbies of the elite. They were tools of formation. They taught the soul to kneel before something greater, to wrestle with the eternal, to search for the true, the good, the beautiful. But in our modern rebellion, we labeled those things oppressive. We mistook form for tyranny, order for violence, virtue for intolerance. And in doing so, we did not make the mind free, we made it formless, void, a blank slate forever smudged by passing trends. This is why, Bloom wrote, students no longer read Plato or Locke or Shakespeare with awe. They read them with suspicion, prepping not to understand, but to indict, not to learn, but to label. The great works that once shaped minds into moral clarity are now seen as threats to emotional comfort. And that's the key. The modern mind is no longer oriented around truth. It is organized around comfort. And comfort, when made a god, always leads to disorientation. Because the soul was not designed to be coddled. It was designed to be refined. It was not made to feel good. It was made to be good. And that goodness cannot grow without confrontation, without contradiction, without the ache of discipline. But the modern mind resists all of this. It rejects hierarchy, tradition, and even reason if they dare to imply limits. And in doing so, it ends up not liberated, but vulnerable, easily manipulated, intellectually shallow, spiritually exposed. What they do not want you to know is that this fragility is not accidental. It is the consequence of casting off the soul's armor. It is the price of treating truth as optional and the self as absolute. They say, you do you. But what if you are lost? They say, live your truth. But what if your truth is a lie? Bloom understood that when we remove the transcendent, we do not make space for new truths. We invite chaos. And chaos always comes disguised as choice. It tells us we are free when we are actually enslaved. To mood, to culture, to appetite, to impulse. It tells us we are open-minded when we are simply unanchored. It tells us we are enlightened when we are actually numb, drifting from screen to screen, cause to cause, identity to identity, unable to endure silence, unable to speak conviction, unable to look in the mirror and see anything but a flickering image of borrowed desire. And in that flickering, we feel it, the ache, the disorientation, the sinking sense that something is missing, something real, something true, something that doesn't bend with every breeze of popular opinion. That missing thing is truth. Not the truth of trends or opinions, but the truth that orders the cosmos, that humbles the mind, that awakens the soul, that demands conversion, not just commentary. But we silenced it. We called it oppressive. We buried it beneath openness. And now, beneath that grave, we hear the muffled cry of a generation that has everything except meaning. The modern mind is not liberated, it is lost. Not because it is evil, but because it has no map. Not because it is dumb, but because it has no compass. Not because it is weak, but because it was never shown that strength begins with submission. Not to the self, but to the truth. When truth is subjective, power fills the void. Once you remove truth as the highest authority, something else must take its place. And in our modern world, that something is power. This is what they don't want you to realize, that relativism doesn't remove control. It simply shifts it, from truth to opinion, from reason to will, from justice to domination. In a world without absolutes, power doesn't disappear. It rules. Bloom knew this, even when few were listening. He saw that relativism, for all its soft language, its tolerance, its inclusivity, its promises of peace, was never neutral. It was preparation. Preparation for a society that could no longer reason, and therefore could no longer resist. A society where truth was too personal to defend, but power was real enough to fear. When truth becomes subjective, the loudest voice wins. When values become relative, the strongest hand decides. When meaning becomes personal, then morality becomes political. And the truth is no longer discovered, it is assigned. And who assigns it? Whoever has the platform, whoever controls the narrative, whoever can silence dissent long enough to create a new consensus. What relativism offers is not peace, it is a war of all against all, waged in the name of self-expression, a marketplace of meaning with no standard of worth, an echo chamber where logic is drowned out by volume and integrity is replaced by influence. This is the irony. The age that most loudly proclaimed the death of hierarchy created a new one. Not of virtue, not of wisdom, but of visibility. The new rulers are not those who speak truth. They are those who shape perception. Because in the absence of truth, perception is everything. And this is why the universities, once guardians of thought, have become battlegrounds of power. Not intellectual power, not moral authority, but cultural leverage. The ability to accuse, to shame, to redefine, to deconstruct. Not in the name of understanding, but in the pursuit of control. Bloom saw this coming. He warned that when students were no longer taught to ask what is true, they would instead ask, what works for me? And from there, the slope is steep and slick. Because when all values are subjective, the only thing left to debate is who gets to decide. Truth no longer restrains power, it serves it. Speech codes, ideological purity tests, trigger warnings, cancellation rituals, these are not about dialogue. They are about dominance. When you can no longer appeal to a shared standard of truth, all that's left is a struggle for narrative control. And the narrative always serves the powerful, not those with truth on their side, but those with platforms, with followers, with outrage they can weaponize. And what they don't want you to know is this: once truth is removed from the equation, it doesn't matter what is right, it only matters who has the mic. This is why debate has been replaced by denunciation, dialogue by performance, inquiry by ideology. Because in a relativistic world, to win an argument doesn't mean to be correct. It means to shut the other person down. It means to overwhelm, to shame, to destroy. And this isn't strength, it's the desperation of a culture that has no center. Bloom reminded us that democracy without truth cannot survive, because democracy depends on persuasion, on discourse, on rational appeal to shared standards. But when everyone has their own truth, persuasion becomes impossible. And what follows is not freedom, but tyranny of the loud, the outraged, the algorithmically amplified. What began as a cry for liberation has become a justification for coercion. We tell ourselves we are more free, but we are afraid, afraid to speak, afraid to dissent, afraid to ask hard questions, afraid to be labeled, afraid to offend the gods of subjectivity who sit on ever-shifting thrones. This is what happens when truth is no longer sacred. Power becomes divine, and power unbound by truth has no conscience. It punishes disagreement as hate. It repackages silence as violence. It weaponizes compassion into compliance. And the people become not citizens of a free society, but actors in a moral theater, constantly auditioning for acceptance, constantly terrified of being cast out. This is not progress. This is regression into tribalism, into fear, into control. Bloom saw that the real danger was not simply intellectual laziness. It was moral and spiritual vulnerability. A society that no longer believes in truth cannot protect itself from tyranny because it cannot recognize it. And here lies the heartbreak. The modern student, stripped of tradition, disconnected from eternal values, taught to see truth as oppressive, has nothing left to stand on. And in their hunger for meaning, they grab at whatever promises purpose, activism, ideology, identity. But these are not foundations. They are weapons. And so the university, once a temple of reason, becomes a battlefield of wills. Professors no longer guide students toward truth. They tiptoe around their fragility. Administrators no longer protect inquiry. They enforce orthodoxy. And the culture does not thrive. It fragments. It radicalizes. It cannibalizes itself. Because when truth is no longer real, the only real thing is the fight for control. And the ones most eager to dominate are often the ones most terrified of being questioned. They dress up their power grabs in moral language. They say they are defending justice. But without truth, justice is just another word for revenge. They say they are protecting the vulnerable. But without standards, protection becomes selective, tribal, and politically useful. And slowly, without realizing it, we begin to fear honesty. We begin to resent conviction. We begin to censor conscience, not from above, but from within. Because when truth is no longer the goal, the pursuit of truth becomes the crime. And the free mind, the truly free mind, becomes the enemy. The soul cannot live on preference alone. The human heart was not made to drift. It was made to believe. And though our culture may deny truth, the ache for meaning persists. Students still feel the hunger, the longing, the existential void. But without the vocabulary of virtue, they turn to substitutes. Addiction, activism, distraction. They seek intensity over intimacy, novelty over wisdom, noise over silence. And when even these fail, they spiral into apathy. Not because they don't care, but because they were never taught what to care about. This is the spiritual crisis of our time. Not a crisis of religion, but of recognition. A generation that sees everything, but understands nothing. The collapse of conviction is not freedom, but judgment. We were told that relativism would save us from war, division, dogma, but instead it delivered confusion, loneliness, and despair. Bloom did not call for blind obedience to tradition. He called for reawakening, a return to the great books, to moral seriousness, to the disciplines that make liberty possible. And his warning remains urgent, because when truth is abandoned, love becomes lust, courage becomes outrage, and liberty becomes license. And when a society no longer knows what is good, it will call evil progress. You were made for more than preference. If you feel the ache, the longing for purpose, for order, for truth, you are not old-fashioned. You are alive. You were not made to drift in the sea of self-expression. You were made to stand on the rock of conviction. And while this world celebrates confusion as compassion and ego as enlightenment, there is still a remnant rising, minds that will not bow to relativism, hearts that will not trade virtue for vanity. Bloom saw what was coming. Now we are living in it. But there is hope, not in the return of old systems, but in the recovery of timeless truths. not in institutional reform, but in personal rebirth. Because when the soul reclaims its hunger for truth, it begins to heal. And when enough souls awaken, so too can a civilization. Final word. You were not left behind. You were set apart. They may call you judgmental, rigid, arrogant, but they don't understand. You're not angry. You're awake. You don't reject the world because you despise it. You walk differently because you refuse to lose your soul for its applause. This isn't rebellion, it's reverence. You're not bitter. You're brave. You're not lost. You're searching. You're not closed-minded. You're clear-eyed. And in a culture spinning deeper into confusion, your commitment to truth isn't hate, it's the last light still burning. So keep standing, keep seeking, keep speaking, because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs clarity and courage. If this message speaks to your spirit, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that truth still matters. This isn't the end of thought. It's the beginning of awakening.